Welcome to Innovation Files. I'm Rob Atkinson, founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
And I'm Jackie Wisman. I head development at ITIF, which I'm proud to say is the world's top-ranked think tank for science and technology policy.
And this podcast is about the kinds of issues we cover here at ITIF, from the broad economics of innovation to specific policy and regulatory questions about new technologies. So if you're into this stuff, please be sure to subscribe and rate us.
Our guest is Alex Capri, who teaches in the business school at the National University of Singapore. He's the author of Techno-Nationalism, How It's Reshaping Trade, Geopolitics and Society, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're not in Singapore, you're in the United States, so we caught you. Had a good time.
And very happy to chat with you.
Your book is extremely comprehensive with chapters on key issues related to techno competition, particularly with China. Explain how you see techno competition.
So techno-competition, or techno-nationalism as I describe it, occurs between nation states. It's because governments perceive technological prowess, innovation, which is linked to their own national entities, their own markets, as a precursor or as a very critical element in national defense and security, economic strength and security, and now increasingly social stability, because of all the technology that is powering social media and information wars and narrative wars and those types of things. There is a clear linkage then between technology and those three elements. Now, I break techno-nationalism down into 6 core elements, and that's the framework that I've used to analyze this greater phenomenon that's occurring around the world. The first element is supply chain weaponization, which essentially means that governments actively use things like export controls and sanctions, and increasingly now scrutiny on outbound foreign direct investment. Where is it going? Is it traceable? And of course, blockages of strategic acquisitions. So that is the first element. And the second element is a direct result of the first, which involves active de-risking or even decoupling of strategic supply chains. The third element, again, a result of the first two, involves things like reshoring of industry, nearshoring, localizing supply chain resiliency efforts, etc. The fourth element is all about, I think, Rob, what you've called innovation mercantilism in the past, but essentially when governments actively look to fund and become catalysts of large-scale innovation around key strategic industries. The fifth element, which is very important, and we're seeing a breakdown of that under the Trump 2.0 era, and that is tech diplomacy, right? How do governments engage other governments to pursue their techno-nationalist agendas jointly? How do they strike up partnerships and alliances around techno-nationalism? And then the sixth element is really more of an existential phenomenon, and that is that all of this is occurring, all these things that I've just described are occurring in a kind of murky sort of hybrid Cold War environment where good and evil walk next to each other everywhere. And you have cyber intrusions and the risk of cyber warfare and cyber theft, along with disinformation campaigns and all of these things happening, even as companies and businesses look to trade, look to increase trade and engage in commercial activities.
You've worked in China or worked around it for many years, and you write about how at the beginning you didn't understand or see what China was doing, but now you recognize it as the beginning of the great power competition. How did that evolution take shape for you?
I think for any expat that was in China, really even in the early 2000s, and was exposed to China's 5-year plans, was exposed to a lot of the, not just the rhetoric, but the discussions that happened in boardrooms at large multinational companies. I was, of course, a consultant in the professional services industry, so I was working with and consulting with virtually all of the big companies, American, European, Japanese, it didn't matter, as they were investing in China, they were building capacity in China, and they were sinking a lot of really important capital into their China operations. So even in that context, there were discussions about the importance of China's return to greatness, the century of humiliation, as I write about in the book, the sensitivity in China that it had been wronged by the West, and therefore the end justified the means as to how China got back to its place in history. And that meant really, frankly, preemptive decoupling being practiced by China for decades now in terms of protecting its local industries, in terms of demanding technology transfer from the West and so forth. So that it became apparent even 2 decades ago that this wasn't going to end well, right? This was eventually going to reach a head, especially as China assumed more and more power and became more and more of a critical player economically, and of course now militarily in the global system. So I think the writing really was on the wall and has been on the wall. I think we in the West, I think, chose to engage in short-term thinking, not really think responsibly when it came to managing the situation.
Alex, you mentioned their sense of humiliation. I was reading a book, I think it was Wealth and Power by Orville Schell, but if I get it wrong, I don't want to. Orville got his book wrong. He noted that one of the reasons why the British got involved with opium trade is that the Chinese emperor refused to allow exports of British textiles. They had a trade barrier. They had a Trump tariff on British textiles. And so British were importing a lot from China, particularly silks, and so they needed to balance trade. So they ended up getting into opium. So I thought it was really interesting that it was originally Chinese protectionism that led to this, or contributed to it, probably a better term. One of the things I really enjoyed about this book is it's almost like I don't want to say an idiot's guide, because that suggests that it's not sophisticated, which it really is. But you deal with every issue. You want to talk about semiconductors, bang. You want to talk about export controls, bang. It's almost like an encyclopedia, which I found quite useful. I think other readers would find it the same way. You can read 5 chapters if those are the ones you're interested in, or you can read the whole book. But in any case, what do you think China's ultimate goal is here in techno-economic competition? What do they want?
Look, I think it's overtly stated. Xi Jinping has said time and time again that self-sufficiency, right, in the strategic technology area is critical to China's success. And that has only been enhanced, that point of view, through the chip wars that we've been enduring and the rolling out of multiple rounds of U.S. export controls. So I think self-sufficiency, more domestic consumption, all are very important to Xi when it comes to not just being able to reduce dependencies and obviously mitigate risks around supply chain weaponization, but also to grow the 12 strategic industries, right, to make China a world leader, right? And so the 12 industries are, which I pretty much have a chapter for each one of these in the book, are obviously semiconductors, as you've mentioned, Rob, AI in all of its various permutations, machine learning, LLMs, obviously quantum, hypersonics, biotech, sensing, timing technologies, aerospace, these types of things. So China wants not only to be self-sufficient, but they also want to be a world leader. And as they are, of course, from a techno-nationalist perspective, investing massively in those 12 strategic technologies.
So I think, as they would say, it's funny, we have, as every organization, you have young people working for you, and none of them know what the $64,000 question is. So here's the $64,000 question. China definitely wants technological self-sufficiency. They can't get whipsawed by the U.S. They definitely want global leadership, but do they want global dominance? I guess that's the real question. Do they see the world big enough? Is it, this bar is not big enough for both of us? Or is it just, we'll be big, you be big, and as long as we're self-sufficient?
That is the $64,000 question. I guess now, because that's a dated show, we call it the $1 million question. But look, this idea, and this is one of the key questions I pose in the book, is can the U.S. and China achieve competitive coexistence? Can we continue to see large volumes, even increasing volumes of trade in an environment maybe where global value chains are, in my opinion, stacked or striated, right? We're looking at three levels of trade, right? And at the top, you have all of the strategic goods that we've been describing. Those, or that part of the global value chain stack, if you will continue to bifurcate because these things are techno-nationalist, because they pertain to national security, et cetera. So I think we will continue to see a bifurcation of the tech stacks in the key strategic areas. The second layer is what I call the gray zone. And that involves thousands of dual use technologies that are traded at high volume, but that situation literally could change overnight, right? As new companies get added to the entity lists. And that could be driven, of course, by some exogenous event that maybe something in the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea, escalation of the Ukraine-Russia war with China somehow implicated. So that's really where I think supply chain managers, trade managers, strategists, anybody navigating a business, that's where they're going to earn their money, right? Is figuring out how to mitigate risk and figuring out how to navigate that gray space. And I think the third area, the bottom layer of the stack, would be the other sort of consumer related, maybe food and beverage or whatever, low end consumer electronics, et cetera, that maybe nobody really cares that much about where it's made and where it's going. So the short answer is, we don't know. We don't know. Can these two superpowers find a way to coexist? It might be messy. It might be dragged out. We may have all kinds of frictions. But at the end of the day, we could see a situation where we have this stacked global economy chugging along for extended time frame.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have my own view, which is this is a mixed martial arts battle to the death. And the only way it's not that is if we bifurcate to some extent. We'll protect Airbus and Boeing in our markets. You can have Comac in your markets. But anyway,
yeah,
we can't have this conversation today. It is April 18th, I believe, without discussing the giant elephant in the room, which is the 240% tariffs or whatever they are today on China. And I think China just announced they're not going above 120, but they're going to do all these other things to screw us over. What I don't think people really fully understand is that's pretty much full decoupling. That's 90% decoupling. Certainly them coming into us.
Yeah.
You're not going to pay. There's a great Onion cartoon, and there was this Chinese guy. I can't believe I work 12 hours a day at 6 cents an hour to produce salad shooters for America. Why do you need salad shooters? So if a salad shooter costs $20, we're not going to pay $65 for, kind of thing. And we don't know what Trump's going to do, and it's all going to play out. But yeah, it's pretty big deal.
That's a really important point, Rob. I think I'm sitting here today on the 18th of April thinking that there may still be some transactional outcomes here where we might possibly see a winding down of the tariffs. Now, if that doesn't happen, then obviously the incentive, as you point out, to trade pretty much anything with that type of tariff on it, I think is going to pretty much lead to pretty rapid decoupling. I don't think there's any way to avoid that. And remember also that once tariffs are imposed, historically, look at Smoot-Hawley, right? Going back in the 1920s, it really took, after the Second World War, it took many years through the GATT rounds in particular, and then obviously ended up not being that effective for the last couple of decades. But it took a long time to unwind tariffs that had been put in place. I think going back to what I've been talking about and what I think I mentioned earlier, and that is that the global economy is going to not just bifurcate around these strategic areas, but it's going to fracture and it's going to regroup, if you will, into new groupings with, again, the Europeans and the Canadians and others that embrace sort of a WTO free trade kind of world, trying to work to resurrect that sort of thing. And then parties that don't play by these rules, in this case, presumably it would be the U.S. under the Trump administration, they get left out. I think China still has a trust issue with the Europeans. I don't see this oversimplified argument really playing out where the U.S. has driven the world into China's arms. Yes, they will talk with China. Yes, there would be continued trade with China, maybe even some increased trade. But China still is viewed as a security threat in Europe. Clearly, China's linkage to the Ukraine war through Russia and other things mean that the world's going to be pretty fragmented going forward.
You had a concept, I thought, a very good concept called the Great Reorganization. And that's all those things we're talking about, the Great Reorganization, away from the Francis Fukuyama utopian of one global market to rule us all. And now we're in this Great Reorganization.
Yeah. And I actually cite Francis Fukuyama when I was a grad student at the London School of Economics a long time ago now, the mid-1990s. His writing was very influential to people like myself, right? The Borderless World, a book that he wrote. And as you say, this idea that globalization combined with the fourth industrial revolution was really creating this new era. And we enjoyed it. It was a very serendipitous kind of 3 decades. We were just lucky to have different factors all come together at once, right? But ultimately, the major incongruities between China and the United States when it came to their economic models ultimately was going to resurface, as I pointed out.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the world we're in now, it's hard to predict more than one day at a time. But if you had to predict, where do you see the results of the US-China tech competition being in, say, 5 years?
Like I said, I think from a techno-nationalist standpoint, we will have a much more decoupled and bifurcated world with strategic supply chains around those 12 power multiplier technologies. What had surprised me, or what I was not prepared for with Trump 2, is the abandonment, if you will, of working with historic allies around techno-security issues. We'll see again in this very transactional ad hoc environment. We will have to wait and see whether Trump gets enough pushback from industry and high net worth individuals that financed his campaign to back off and re-engage with allies, right? This must be the nightmare of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who's essentially a neocon and sees the value of strategic partnerships and alliances when it comes to competing with China. We have to wait and see how that will play out, all right? That's the techno-diplomacy element of techno-nationalism. But it's going to have to. The United States is going to have to work with partners and allies to achieve a lot of its techno-nationalist objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, we need to begin to wrap up, but it reminds me of a piece I wrote just a couple of weeks ago that I was so frustrated by hearing people like Paul Krugman and others saying, Trump is an idiot, Trump has no plan, he's just pulling the stuff out of where. And I'm like, no. There's a strategy, there's a vision, there's a goal, in my opinion, between what they're trying to do. You can then argue, is it the right goal? And then you can argue, even if that's the right goal, is it the right tactic? But I think you made a really key point. Rubio and I really have a lot of respect for Senator Rubio. We worked closely with him when he was in the Senate. He's super strong on these kind of techno-economic policy questions. But at the end of the day, I think there's a core part of the White House that just says, we don't need to be engaged with the world. They're Europeans. Yeah. We don't want to be Europeanized, or certainly don't want to be Asianized. And so they're like, yeah, not a bad life here. Just make sure the Mexicans and the Canadians mind their P's and Q's. And that's going before Woodrow Wilson, in my view. That's a very different vision of America.
I would be hard-pressed to see a sort of clear, coherent strategy. But at the same time, I would also say that there clearly is a need to return a certain strategic manufacturing capabilities to the United States, right? It's not helpful to basically point out all the reasons why this is impossible and not address that issue. But I do think that it is a big mistake not to be working more closely with our historic partners and allies around achieving those ends.
Only if you don't mind China winning. This is, to me, my biggest fear, our biggest fear. Maybe you didn't push them into the China orbit, but you let them get attracted into the China orbit. And I think you say this in the book, too, Alex. We can't win this without allies working together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because again, I think technology is used in many different ways, including some very nefarious ways, right? To some very anti-democratic, nefarious ways. And it can happen not only in a techno-authoritarian regime, but in a democratic regime as well, right? I think that it's important to work together around the rule frameworks as well as developing the technology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish we could keep going. I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book. It's not only worth the read, but it's something good to have on your shelf because it's also really good reference material. So it's both of those. Alex, I really want to thank you for being here, and it was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob and Jackie. I appreciate it.
And that's it for this week. If you liked it, please be sure to rate us and subscribe. Feel free to email show ideas or questions to podcast@itif.org. You can find the show notes and sign up for our weekly email newsletter on our website, itif.org, and follow us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn at ITIFDC.
We have more episodes and great guests lined up, and we hope you'll continue to tune in.
Talk to you soon.